Welcome to the University of Michigan Dentistry Podcast Series, promoting oral health care worldwide.
As we consider the preoperative analysis for the Class 5 cavity, considering the restoration of this with cohesive gold, we want to consider a number of factors. One being the position of the carious lesion in relationship to the gingival tissue. And as I'm viewing this now, sitting in the operator's position about 11 o'clock, we see that the carious lesion is just supragingivally. It's a lesion that is at the cemento-enamel junction and down into the enamel. We've got to consider, of course, the isolation of this site in order for us to do the cohesive gold. In planning the preparation, we will be doing a farrier design. The farrier design is really trapezoidal in shape. The occlusal margin that would include just the occlusal aspect of the carious lesion. That margin would parallel the plane of occlusion, carry on over to an area that is just subgingival on the distal, an angle formed subgingivally. On the mesial aspect, the plane of occlusion line again being followed just subgingivally, then an angle formed, again forming this trapezoid in a straight line carrying across to the distal cervical aspect. The farrier design then is trapezoidal in shape. It is made up of a series of 4 straight lines, which gives convenience in the finishing operation as well as in the preparation of the cavity. We'll consider then the placement of the restoration in relation to the carious lesion. In order to have a guide for this, it's well often to use a sharp pencil to pencil in the line of the free gingival margin. Then if we include this line in the preparation, we know that we are indeed extending subgingivally. The subgingival placement here being necessary because of the position of the carious lesion, and also would give us a better aesthetic effect. Again, principally the external outline form of the Class 5 preparation is determined by the carious lesion and its size. Secondly, by the contour of the gingival tissue, and thirdly, by the position of the occlusal plane. So we're ready to carry out now the isolation of the operating site utilizing the 212S rubber dam clamp and tissue retractor. We now have the Class 5 carious lesion isolated. We observe the pencil line that was placed at the level of the free gingival margin. The 212S rubber dam clamp has been placed and fixed into position and stabilized with the higher fusing compound. We'll initiate the cavity preparation using a 33.5, a steel burr in a straight handpiece, using the base of that burr to approach and establish then the mesial margin. I'm using also a plastic instrument to protect the rubber dam in this immediate area of the operating site. So we'll enter into the carious lesion, and with the base of that burr, extend on over to include our reference point, letting this preparation, of course, be based in to dentin, based into dentin sufficiently so that we can establish retention in this area. All right, the mesial wall now is prepared. We want to do that same thing with the distal wall. I've moved now from the 11 o'clock position to a 7 o'clock position in order to carry on with the preparation of the cavity, and we'll be starting in the carious lesion area, and again with the base of the burr, beginning to establish the distal wall of the preparation. Again, this is forming the two sides of the trapezoid, one side having been formed with the mesial wall, and the distal wall now just about complete. Again, we're putting the base of the burr against that distal wall and the edge of the burr so that we are penetrating into dentin. And obviously the base of that burr is paralleling enamel rod directions. We know that there is the change in direction as we would take cross-section through that tooth. Now we've extended there, and we'll now move into the position at the cervical, again using the base of the burr to establish that cervical wall. Joining together the two sides, the mesial and distal wall. Again, we're essentially in dentin, this being just beyond the cemento-enamel junction. Once that wall is formed, we'll then use the base of the burr to establish, or the base of the burr against the axial wall in order that we might use the side of the burr in establishing the occlusal aspect. Again, here we're into enamel. We want that side of the burr to be at such a position so that we will parallel enamel rod direction. And we're winding up now in the central area with a little bulge in that axial wall that's not necessary. Indeed, that bulge should be removed. And we'll be establishing an axial wall that has a general contour of the outer surface of the tooth. Coming back to this distal wall again, just for a moment. Using here again the straight hand piece as opposed to the contrangle because of the convenient access that we have and the minimal kind of tooth reduction that is necessary. All right, we move now to a 6.5, 2.5, 9, which is a bone angle or chisel. You can use that to plane off that axial portion. We've really removed all caries at this time. We want to establish just a wall against which we can establish good condensation, working towards sharpness to internal line angles of the preparation. And then we'll use the Wiedelstadt chisel in order to plane the cervical margin here first. The straight line to the outline form being appropriate from the standpoint of convenience of forming the outline form. As far as cavity preparation is concerned. It's also convenient from the standpoint of finishing. Once we find that straight line, it makes finishing then an easier task, really, to follow that. Making sure that we are smooth and regular in outline form. Now we'll move down to planing of the occlusal wall. Here again is our major enamel wall. Indeed wish to have enamel rod direction, of course, being paralleled here. I'm swinging up just a bit into a 9 o'clock position in order to better approach that occlusal wall to the mesial. Again, the only walls that we will have that will be exposed in a usual situation with caries at and just cervical to the free gingival margin, the only wall that will be exposed will be that occlusal. Now we'll move back to the 6.5, 2.5, 9 again and consider the retentive form. Retention is going to be placed, the major position will be cervical, the minor position will be in the occlusal area. With the 6.5, 2.5, 9, it'll be placed, the bevel of the cutting edge really against the axial wall. The cutting edge itself placed in and extending that axial wall into a cervical position with a lateral scraping motion. Getting that in the central area and working off to the mesial, and oftentimes necessary to use one hand in guiding the instrument, the other in the application of force. I have that area work to the mesial, then go ahead and work the distal aspect of that wall in a similar manner. Again, it's a cervical extension of that wall, not a deepening in a pulpit direction. Once the retention is completed there, and of course we'll be checking this with an Explorer in a moment, we can move on into the same type of a retentive form in the cervical, or in the occlusal area in this case, starting in the central area and dragging that instrument across in a mesial direction. And once that retention then has been established, starting with it in the central area again and drawing that instrument across in the distal direction. All right, now let's look at the retentive form as far as testing with an Explorer is concerned. We've got a continuous groove that runs across that area. At the occlusal and in the cervical area, we have to do a bit more finishing, gain a little better smoothness on this distal wall, the preparation, and a little bit more at the cervical aspect. We've now completed the smoothing of the margins of the preparation. We have also applied cavity varnish to the prepared cavity and removed varnish from the margins of the preparation. We We'll do this with the cohesive gold because of the possibility of contamination and the folding of any of the varnish at those margins and creating a thickness of that material that would be detrimental. I think it's well here too to notice the position of that gingival retractor, the rubber dam clamp, the 212 clamp in relation to the gingival margin of the preparation. There is that half millimeter space or half millimeter plus that's necessary in order to have access to the condensation of this margin. And obviously it's the ability to gain this type of isolation that permits us to do the Class 5 cohesive gold. Now let's look at the criteria that we have for the preparation. Again, the margins and walls and cavity definition. The enamel walls are parallel to rod direction. There is really no bevel in this case because of the use of the electroalloy. The walls and margins are smooth and the cavity is well defined. And we see here this to be true. The mesial wall, for example, is at a direction that is perpendicular to this outer surface. The distal wall likewise is perpendicular to the outer surface of the tooth. The occlusal wall essentially is perpendicular to that outer surface, and we've tested these walls with hand instruments to assure that there is a paralleling of enamel rods. In the cervical area, we're into cementum. Again, we're merely forming essentially a perpendicular margin at that position. Now, the retention certainly is of importance. We're going to be wedging the material against the walls, but we ought to see retention being conspicuous visually and tactily. As we have viewed the preparation, we can see that there is a distinct angle that's formed in this cervical margin area. There is no retention to the mesial or distal walls. There is minor retention, however, that we place with a 6.5, 2.5, 9 in the occlusal wall also. The external outline form, again, was dictated by caries, by the position of the occlusal plane, and by the position of the gingival tissue that we noted with the pencil outline that we had previously. As we look then at the tooth, again, we are beyond those margins of the pencil outline, both mesially, cervically, and on the distal. It's necessary because of the size of the lesion and also the place of those margins in that area because of convenience form. We've carried only a minimal to a minimal position in the occlusal area, merely eliminating the carious lesion. The internal outline form in this case is extended into dentin in order that we can place our retention into dentin. There's been caries removal but no excessive tissue loss. Looking at the preparation again with the cohesive gold, there is not only regularity to the internal outline form, there is the sharp angles that are formed because of the hand instrument application in creating that internal form. There is a curvature to the axial wall. It's a curvature that follows the outer surface of the tooth and the pulp chamber. It's curved in a mesial distal direction as well as in a cervical occlusal direction. The length of that occlusal wall is deeper because of the thickness of enamel there and the need to place retention within dentin without undermining the dentin-enamel junction. A model of the preparation perhaps shows some of the features of the preparation a bit better. The Farrier design, again, having the trapezoidal shape to it. The mesial and distal margins being and paralleling the mesial and distal line angles of the tooth. We see here some regularity and curvature to the axial wall position, depth, of course, that's sufficient to provide retention or area for retention form. If we look at a cross-section of that model, we see again the greater length of the occlusal wall because of the need for this position in order to place retention within dentin without undermining the dentin-enamel junction. We see the major retention at the cervical area. In this model, showing the bevel at the cervical, which we have not used with the preparation that we have made for the alloyed cohesive gold, this being unnecessary and undesirable for this material. Bevel being used with the cohesive gold foil itself. We'll begin condensation using the alloyed filling gold electrolyte, a piece of material that's cut about the size of the axial wall. Placing this into position and using the 13 and the 14 condensing instruments, one to hold in this case and the other to now lay this against the axial wall portion, getting it into position first, and then begin condensation starting in the central area and working that material overlapping in the central area, working first towards the cervical margin. The sustained rocking motion, condensation occurring here to gain the adaptation to the walls of the preparation, initially into the area of retention, to gain the uniform compactness and so on, meeting the objectives of condensation. Then we'll work down to the area in the occlusal aspect, again rocking from central to occlusal wall area, carrying that throughout the preparation in its entirety. And I'll move over and hold this on the distal aspect now while we condense the mesial aspect where the opposite condenser had been used as a holding instrument. So we'll continue then, now that we have this material locked into the retention, and it's well perhaps at this moment to assure ourselves of that locking, taking even an explorer, removing the instrument and trying to dislodge the gold. We see that it is locked into place. We'll continue now to bring about condensation, building this in a depressed axial wall, condensing against the margins of the preparation until we have the preparation completed and can then think of the contour. Condensation now is nearly complete for this class 5. We're building up to appropriate contour, again with this forceful sustained pressure, overlapping of each condensing action that we apply. I think that we have perhaps a little deficiency yet in the mid-occlusal area. We're taking off any of this excess material that extends beyond the margins, getting rid of that so that we can maintain the general position of that external outline form. We'll lay another piece of foil into that area, get it to place, and carry on then with condensation. You see, as we apply this piece of metal, the alloyed filling gold to the surface, there is the immediate coherence of the material. Care has to be exercised in condensing near the margins, of course, so that we don't have the condensing instrument lie directly on that enamel margin, obviously there would be a problem here, one of destroying the integrity of that enamel margin itself. All right, condensation now is, I think, complete. One way of checking this is to get a view of the area using a mirror, and we've just now placed a mirror on up into that mesial aspect, getting a view that shows us that we do have some slight excess material there. That should be sufficient to enable us to carry out the finishing. The rind trimmer is usually used to initiate the contouring of this restoration. Here, however, we will begin by using a carving instrument to remove some of the excess material. This material is of a light, fluffy nature that is left between the serrations of the condenser. This then initiates the contouring and finishing procedure. The 5C continues to bring about the initial contouring of the foil with a fairly heavy, forceful burnishing action. In the cervical position, it's well then to begin using the 5S burnisher. We'll use that burnishing again from metal out towards the periphery to the margin, doing that similarly on over into the mesial margin area. This is really a continuation of the condensation, even though it does initiate also the contouring and finishing. Now, also in the cervical area, in order to remove the excess material, we can use perhaps the gold foil knife, and this is going to be a little large, we see, to fit into this position. So instead we'll use the Wiedelstadt chisel, which gives us a smaller size in order to carry out that contouring. Now, this fits better into that area, and it's used with a push motion, just picking up a small amount of the surface of the metal, carrying that down to get rid of that small excess material at that point, and you see exposing then the cervical margin. Care must be exercised here that we don't denude the cemental surface in this area because of the type of hypersensitivity that this tends to then create. We can also use that off into the mesial area slightly. Again, just exposing that margin, the slight excess contour that we have at that point. We can then move into the use of the rotary instruments, and we'll begin on this mesial segment using the fine sand disc to initiate the contour in this area. If there was gross contour, we would be utilizing perhaps the carrot-shaped stone to do this reduction. Removing material carefully from this area. Let's just change that disc in order that we can establish the contour and develop the kind of surface finish here that's going to be desirable for us. With each of the discs that are used, they should go through the little flexing procedure here to soften that disc so that it does contour on the restoration. Just using the back end of the 5S in order to accomplish that. Care again coming up just to that margin area and not getting on to cementum and denuding that area. So we'll carry on with the series of paper discs here, bringing about this final contouring, leading in then to the polishing stage. We've carried through our successive stages of discs and now are using the silex in a rubber cup, using air spray continued on this as a coolant, and also using the material dry in order that we can keep our eye on the cervical margin and keep the rubber cup and abrasive material off from the cemental surface. So we're complete with that area. We'll just cleanse the area with the airstream and move now into the use of the tin oxide as an abrasive material. Again, rather lightly. Air continuing to play across this area. Now we'll stop just for a moment, pick up some more tin oxide and approach this on the distal area. And that is sufficient. Now we'll go ahead and cleanse this with water and with air in the evacuator. So that we can get a better view of the margins and the contour of the restoration. We can see then that the restoration has certainly a high finish to it, that their margins are appropriate here as far as straightness is concerned. Let's just think of the criteria themselves for the final restoration. The surface of the gold is smooth and it's well polished. We see this as evidenced from the restoration. In fact, the highlight that we have in this area may be objectionable aesthetically, and following the removal of the rubber dam and the cleansing of that area and the return of soft tissue, we may wish to dull that area very slightly, but leaving the highly polished area subgingivally. Secondly, in the criteria of margin integrity, there's no evidence of a crevice along the margin that's detectable with an explorer. And if we look at the restoration itself, we see that there is, as we move from restoration to tooth and across margins in all areas, that, again, there is no detectable margin. Regarding the anatomy and contour, we're principally concerned here, of course, with the axial contour. As we would view this intraorally using a mirror to project the profile of this, we do see that there is a continuity with this buccal surface, continuation of the axial contour from tooth tissue down into the restoration. So this then completes for this segment the Class 5 alloyed filling gold restoration. We're now ready to do the removal of the rubber dam. The rubber dam now has been removed, which has allowed the gingival tissue to return to its preoperative state. We see again that the only visible margin is really the occlusal margin. The original high finish that we had placed with the tin oxide and the rubber cup has also been reduced slightly, going back now into this area that is visible, using the Silex again to put a slightly matte finish on this surface and have the restoration less conspicuous. So this then completes the Class 5 cohesive gold restoration utilizing the alloyed filling gold material.
You've been listening to a presentation from the University of Michigan School of Dentistry, which is dedicated to supporting open learning and open educational resources. This recording is licensed under the Creative Commons. It may be reused and redistributed for nonprofit use. Please attribute materials to the University of Michigan School of Dentistry and redistribute under this same license. For more information on how this and other University of Michigan School of Dentistry recordings may be used, visit www.dent.umich.edu/license.